start off. My name's Ken Graham. I was a programmer at Williams. Originally hired there to do the port of the 2600 games, all the classic Williams Defender, Stargate, Robotron, over to the 2600 cartridges. And so they hired 3 of us to do it. And then the week after they said, congratulations, you're the new 2600 department. They said, stop working and sit on your thumbs for a while. Because we're in negotiations with Atari to have them do the cartridges because they want to do them right. So we said, okay, fine. You know, and 1 week turned into 2 weeks, and 2 weeks turned into 3 weeks. I finally went to my manager and said, please, give me something to do. So he sent me down to the art department. They quickly found out that I can't stack 2 pixels on top of each other right the same way 3 times, so they asked me to rebuild the art system. So that was my first project at Williams, was rebuilding the art system. Basically, it was a modified version of the standard game board with some specialized ROMs. They used joysticks and buttons to put all the pixels on. And they'd build them frame by frame, and then they'd run it to do the animations and clean up. I mean, by today's standards, it's like, it's so crude, it's unbelievable. But that's what we had. You know, and we were happy to have it back then. So after I did that, then it was like, well, what's next? Well, we have this other game in the corner that Christina's been working on all by herself. Why don't you go give her a hand? The game at the time was called Monkey Marathon because it was a game about monkeys running a marathon. And about 3 or 4 weeks into it, the marketing department came down and said, we got some intel that Atari's going to be making a monkey game too, so you can't have a monkey game. You got 3 days. Come up with a new concept. Oh my God. The way games were developed back in the bad old days was you started, you could come up with a concept on your own, or there was a box of concepts that the game designers had put together, and you just pull one out, just like the job jar. And you look at it and go, oh, this is the one I want. And so, in this case, Christina had come up with the concept. She was tired of shoot-em-ups. She wanted a game that little kids could get into, because she had a little kid. And she didn't want him playing all those violent, nasty, shoot-em-up, die, space aliens, eat my brains kind of games. So she started, and like I said, we got into it, and they came up with a concept. What do we do with a concept? So we're sitting around at a table, and one of the guys came in and dropped off a book that he borrowed from me. The book was called A Spell for Chameleon by Piers Anthony. It's a Xanth series, for those of you who may not know the original one and know the 27th volume of it. It's been obviously a very popular one for him, but it's all about magic and puns, and so it was like, we just sort of, the book laid on the table for a while, and somebody said, what's that? And I said, oh, I loaned this book. What's it about? And magic and puns and this and that, and they're like, cool! So it became Magical Marathon. And somebody in marketing didn't like magical, so he thought mystic sounded cooler. So it became Mystic Marathon. And so we recast the monkeys. They became the little characters. There's a little bit of trivia. If any of you have ever actually read the poem that scrolls through the track mode. Does anybody here know what those little guys are called? They're called Bennykins. 2 guesses as to why they're called Bennykins. Anybody want to take a stab at it?
Everybody like to eat lunch at Bennigan's?
I bet so.
No, that's one. No. Christina's little boy was named Benny.
Oh.
So, there's a lot of the stuff, there's no real deep meaning for it. It just sort of, hey, that sounds cool. Okay, let's go with it. Because back in those days, I mean, it's not like today. If any of you know anybody who's in the game design industry now, they start out with a team of 40 designers, and they bring on 60 artists, and then they get 100 animators, and then they get 200 programmers, and then they cancel the project because they're over budget. Back in the bad old days, we would start with a programmer and artist. They'd have 3 months to put a prototype together. If there was enough interest in the prototype, you got another 3 months, they'd give you another programmer, maybe another artist. You could start doing some of the cabinet work. Cinestar was probably the biggest team. It had 4 programmers, 1 artist, and everybody in the design staff claimed to be the designer of it. So, but that's the bad old days. We're talking about I was going to talk about the architecture. So, all of you are probably familiar with this. The basic, everybody calls it the CPU board. The engineers who designed it called it the MPU board. I'll talk about why. But for the most part, the classic series pretty much had 5 pieces to it. You had the MPU board, you had the ROM board, the I/O board, sound board, power supply, in that huge cabinet, and the monitor, of course. And so when somebody goes, I think this thing is worth like $3,000, just tell them, that's a lot of expense for a lot of dead air in there. There's nothing in that box. But I'm going to run through real quickly. These are more or less my categorizations of the boards. Other people have other ones, but it all gets messed up, and people tend to not know which games run on which boards and so on, so I'm going to walk through that as well. What I call Gen 0 are the Defender boards. Defender board, so-called early edition. I call it Gen 0 Rev A. Rev B. Major difference between the two: battery up, battery down. As near as I can tell, the stability, that's a Rev D. There's the Defender board. Anyway, as far as I'm concerned, the stability of both boards is negligible at this point in time. 30 years out, I will spend hours and hours and hours to get these boards running, because they ran so much of it so close to the tolerances of the chips, and that's brand new chips. These are 30-year-old chips. They don't run like that anymore. Neither do I. So, it takes forever to fix those boards, but it is possible. The other offshoot of that was a Tato game called Colony 7. They licensed the Defender technology. They took the Defender motherboard. Basically, they took all of these headers on here, turned them 90 degrees, and what they did was they created a combination ROM, I/O, and sound board as a secondary daughter board that sat over top of it. So they made a 2-board stack out of it instead of a 3-board stack. Pros and cons of doing that. Personally, this is really easy to fix in the field. If any of you have gone out in the field, you go, is it the ROM board or the MPU or the I/O board? Well, let me just pull one, put a new one in, pull one, put a new one in, pull one, put a new one in. Okay, we're running again. Good, let's go. And that's what it was like for the operators. I mean, when that game was down, it wasn't sucking quarters. And that was the name of the game back then, was sucking quarters out of your pockets. Especially mine, Defender and Stargate. Suck at those games. But, so that pretty much, when they built this, there were some design considerations of it. One of which was that the soundboard was going to be the next gen soundboard for the pinballs. Look, over there. It was what the manager did. He stole the soundboard. He actually stole both of them. This is Gen 1 soundboard, which you may recognize from some of the real early solid states. Tri-Zone, World Cup pinball. They all came with those guys. I was going to bring one of the other ones. You're all familiar with them, the little square ones. They're basically all the same chips, just rearranged a little bit. The MPU board was actually originally going to be a pinball board, and they stole that from the pinball guys. And of course, because you don't have that big switch matrix, which is always the driver board, which is always a pain on the pinballs, they could get away with a little one, so they designed that. So everything else pretty much on Defender was stolen from the pinball line. And when they were working on the cabinets, they stole everything. Power supplies, the coin doors, whatever they could get a hold of. And finally the pinball manager went to the CEO and said, "You gotta stop this." Why? I have 300 pinball machines waiting for parts that the Defender guys keep stealing. And the CEO looked at him and said, "Yeah, okay, I'll talk to him." So they went to Chicago Coin and got the black doors. So that's why some Defenders have silver doors, the old pinball doors, and some have the black Chicago Coin doors. That didn't stop them from stealing the soundboards and nuts and bolts and anything else they could steal off the pinball line, because they were selling 2,000 to 3,000 Defenders a week at that point.
Wow.
They sold 128,000 Defenders roughly. I think the best any of the pins ever did was about 3,200 or not 32,000.
Yeah, understanding.
So from the economy of scale, that's why the CEO was like, yeah, we'll take care of it. Keep going! Because that was driving everything. So the hardware engineers got their marching orders to redo the boards, make them nicer, faster, more stable, all the good things that electrical engineers do, and that they came up with the Gen 1 boards, which, let's see, I had these laid out so I knew what I was doing, and of course, okay, Defender board. And there's a B. Not a whole lot of difference, but what they did was they started running the chips. They redid some of the chips so that they're not running as close to the edges of tolerances, and they cleaned up a few things. Unfortunately, they also messed up a few things. When you have, back in those days, you have several thousand boards already, you're going to fix them. So the Rev Bs have these two little wires that come off of it.
When the Dutch was so big at that time, like if you had when they tested one of the boards, if it tested bad, did you try to fix it, or did you just throw it in the trash and go on to the next one?
No, they trashed them.
Really?
Yeah, they'd strip all the
chips out,
all the socketed chips, and then they would go in this big bin to be reclaimed at some other point. As far as I know, that either that bin is still down in the basement of the California Avenue building, or somebody did eventually get a dumpster and throw it out. But yeah, I mean, it was really, they actually had the technical term of bed of nails tester. And it would literally, you would mount this to a frame and you would put it down, and it would power certain parts up and run certain tests against it. I mean, it's the coolest thing. I mean, I would love to get a hold of one of those things, because that would make fixing these boards so much cooler. But as far as I know, those were scrapped years ago. So I'll have to do it the old-fashioned way. But so that was Rev 0, and the way you find out what it is, I know I get this question all the time. Right underneath the Williams logo on there, there's a serial number and then a revision number. The Rev Zeros will just have a Rev with a dash. Sometimes it's called a Rev dash board. Those came out with Stargate. They were originally going to be putting them into Robotron. Well, that's when they found out that they needed those two little wires. Because Stargate didn't use the DMA chips on the ROM card, and I had this other box that's still sitting right next to my cell phone at home. Technology. But on the ROM boards, you'll see the newer ones have these, by newer, Joust, Stargate, or not Stargate, but Robotron, they'll have these two big 40-pin chips on the back corner. Those are DMA chips. They call them special chips, so they couldn't leak the secrets that they were just DMA chips. DMA stands for direct memory access. Basically, it was a way to get memory from here to there without using the CPU. The 6809, and if I go way too deep in the weird technical geek stuff, just fall asleep, I'll get the hint. It actually takes the clock and it splits it into three parts. The first part is owned by the CPU. That's when it sucks in instructions. It uses the rest of the two clock cycles to process those and do something. Now, if it's not doing something, those other two clock cycles are available for anybody else on the bus, meaning the two special chips. And so what you would do when you're building the game was you would point to the image that you wanted, and you would tell the chip, take this, throw it there in memory, and then keep going, and it would do it, bam. And the CPU at the time, the 6809, runs at 1 megahertz. Does anybody have a smartphone in here? Yeah. Probably if you've got one that's about 3 years old, and nobody does anymore, but if you have one that's about 3 years old, it runs at about 1 gigahertz.
Right.
Gigahertz is 1 billion cycles per second. This runs at 1 million cycles per second. So your cell phone's running 1,000 times faster than these games. You don't even want to know how fast the desktop computer is that's running on the machine. As I was telling these guys earlier, I tried to find the benchmarks of the CPUs to try and match up a 6809 against a modern CPU. They don't even go down that low anymore, and they changed all the benchmarks because the old benchmarks would be over so fast they couldn't measure it on the new ones. So I can't give you that, but if you just take frequency, your cell phone's running 1,000 times faster than these guys.
And the old stuff is only 8 bits wide.
8 bits wide, so you have a maximum of 64K of memory to play in. How many of you have a 64K cell phone? Didn't think so. So, anyway, the main difference in Gen 1 between Stargate and the rest were the addition of the DMA chips. And that was, like I said, that occasioned the Rev B board, which shortly afterwards became the Rev Seaboard, which looks just the same, but it doesn't have the little green wires on it. And that lasted through most of Robotron and Joust. Towards the end of Joust, they came out with the Rev D board, and then all of Cinestar was the Rev D board, as was Splat. Bubbles, the engineers doing the usual thing, like to play with the boards and tweak them and try different things. Here's a Rev D board, and here's a Bubbles board. Anybody see the difference? Well, I replaced the battery holders. Yeah, because and I'll talk about that in a little while. Remind me if I don't. Ignoring that, if you look up here,
Extra chip.
there's an extra chip. There's an extra CMOS chip. This is 4 bits wide. This is 8 bits wide. But that's the difference. Now, it's important because about every 6 months or so, I get a board set in. I got this Robotron. It doesn't work. It has a Bubbles MPU board. They deliberately adjusted the lines on here so that between the old boards and the new boards, you plug the ROM in, it won't work. It won't fry anything, but it just won't work. It comes up looking like it's totally dead. And the same thing if you take a Bubbles ROM board and plug it into any of the other Rev B, C, or D boards, boom, it looks like it's dead. DOA, somebody sold me a bad set. No, they sold you a mismatched set. I get that usually because somebody goes and buys one on one eBay auction, and then they buy the other on another eBay auction, and they put them together and it's dead, and then I get this email. Do you fix Williams boards? Yes, I do. I'm taking a moratorium right now until I get the 7-foot stack of boards I have in the repair queue out of the way.
Can you kind of rewire? Can you modify it to make them work with each other?
Oh yeah, yeah. You can take the C and D boards, and basically what you do is you bend out a couple of the pins on the CMOS. You attach it piggyback style on top of here, and then you run jumpers over to the other signals that you need. Basically, it piggybacks on the address bus, and then you piggyback over to a couple of other signals, the chip select, and it looks really nasty. I mean, if you've ever seen 2 chips, we won't go there. Anyway, but yes, you can do that. The biggest problem that you have to do then is that if you mod one of these to run Bubbles, then you have to take the Bubbles chips off of the ROM card and put it onto a Robotron or Joust ROM card. Because remember, the headers were rewired. Unless you want to rewire one of those ribbon cables, cut here, solder there. But it's not that hard to find Bubbles boards. It's definitely not that hard to find the rest of these. So the effort of converting one to the other is like, why bother? I mean, it's just a lot. I mean, unless you like doing it just for grins. If you want to do it just to say, yeah, I did it.
Well, you also have the multi-Williams running on the actual hardware too.
Yeah, I'm gonna talk about that, and once I get through this section. Remind me if I don't. I'm like Keith. I got 1,000 things going on in my head, and I sometimes don't always grab them down. So I have these two with asterisks on them. And I kind of had one on Cinestar because it's kind of its own little animal because it's got that great big ROM card. And the biggest feature of that ROM card was that it has a bunch of coils on it, and it has 2 static RAM chips on it. Those static RAM chips were used for primarily as offline storage for the Cinestar. The Cinestar is 14 pieces or 15 pieces. I think there's a center piece and then all of the pieces around the outside. And as the Cinestar is being built, it's actually being built into that static RAM so the blitters can go bam and take him on, because otherwise it would be, how many pieces okay. It would have to blit 15 times to get the whole thing over there, whereas if they build it into that little piece, as a piece gets built, they blit it onto that static RAM, and when he comes on the screen, they blit it from the static RAM rather than the pieces in ROM. It was an efficiency sort of thing because poor little CPUs just don't run as fast as your cell phones. So you had to cheat That's an operative term that you'll hear a lot of. You hear some of the old programmers is cheat. I got to cheat to get cycles out. I got to cheat to do this. If you go and just watch the attract mode on the Mystic Marathon, you'll see that big logo kind of scrolling down. You wouldn't believe what I had to do to cheat to get that thing to scroll down. That's actually scrolling at its maximum. It's almost half the screen. Back in those days, it couldn't do that. I mean, that half the screen's worth of pixels in one refresh cycle. Like I said, you wouldn't believe what I have to do to cheat. I have to watch the refresh, and after it's gone past the line, I start blitting the next pieces in. So as the refresh on the beam goes down, I'm actually blitting the next image in behind it. Otherwise, it would never be able to make it. Yeah, that one freaked a lot of people out. That was the largest image moving on screen until I think 1987 or 88, when they got a 68,000 based Jamemorg board to be able to put more than that. Gen 1.5, sort of a hybrid again. Blaster has, and I have a Blaster set that's in for repair, and I meant to bring that because it's kind of an odd looking board. But they crammed a lot of the features all into one board again. So rather than having the 3 boards, it's basically one big board. The next one after that were what I call the Gen 2s. That's Joust 2, Mystic Marathon, Inferno, and Turkey Shoot. And they look like this. This happens to be a Mystic Marathon board set. And they go together like that. They don't fit on the door anymore. So they had to redo. When they released Mystic Marathon, they released it as a conversion kit. It was actually done before Joust 2, but as I was talking about earlier, you don't die in it. You just don't win the race. So you have to buy in to continue. And nobody shoots at you, and there's no aliens in it, and they just didn't know what to do with it. So they put it on the shelf after it was done. And then, of course, Williams kind of ran on some hard times like all the video games makers did in the 80s, and they were like, we need to sell something. What can we sell? So they decided a conversion kit, because they weren't sure they could actually sell cabinets with the game in it. So they sold it as a conversion kit for Stargates, Robotrons, Joust, Bubbles, Moon Patrol cabinets, Cinestar cabinets. And so there were actually 3 versions of it. One for Defender, and one for the Joust sized cabinets, and then one for Bubbles, Moon Patrol, Cinestar sized cabinets. They made 500 of them. 100 for Defender, 200 for Joust, and 200 for the narrower cabinets. I have 1% of the total population of boards that was ever made. I have no idea how many are still alive. I've managed to track 17 board sets down. Of the 5 actual cabinets that were built for Mystic Marathon, I know of one that has survived. One was definitely burned in a fire. One was converted into something and lost into some dusty warehouse somewhere. 2, nobody knows whatever happened to them. Is that 5? I think so. I usually count on my fingers so I can keep track of it. Anyway, so there's like one dedicated Mystic Marathon left in the world. It's not the one on the floor. The one on the floor is actually cooler than that. It's a prototype. It has a prototype ROM set in it. There's not much different, but there are a few little differences in the way some of the animations go. The last time that one surviving Mystic Marathon was sold. It sold for $5,000. So it's one of those games that you either love it or hate it. Give it a try. You're not going to hurt my feelings if you come up and tell me that it sucks. It's the worst game you have ever played and you hate it.
What was the environment like when you were programming? What equipment did you have? How did you get it to how did you get it over to the machine to try it out? Like, how did that all work?
When I was working on the art system, I had a Robotron, 2 joysticks and a few extra buttons, and probably one of these board sets in it. And then the only major difference to it was that the ROM board, instead of having ROMs on it, had static RAM. And they used the coin door PIA chip as a serial port. So you could plug it into the VT100s. If any of you remember those old monstrosities that were connected to the VAX. All of our work was done on a VAX with a cross compiler and then downloaded through your terminal into your workstation, which just happened to be a video game cabinet instead of a workstation. When Mystic Marathon came out, it obviously didn't fit in the cabinets anymore. So basically it was nailed to a piece of plywood and nailed to your wall. You know, which was, we had to find the right walls because the early versions of this used to knock out channels 2, 3, and 4 for 6 blocks around the building. So we had to find, we're knocking out, let's try that one. Oh yeah, okay, it's only sending this way, so we only get 3 complaints a day about it. So they eventually had to put Faraday cages around them just to keep from knocking it out, and that's why you start seeing with the Rev Ds, these coils, the FCC started getting really upset about all the RF emissions that these games were putting out. So you had to pass their emissions tests, and so they start putting stuff on them to make it work. So basically that covers what I call the classic architecture, because they're all, even though the form factors have changed, the basic underlying technology is pretty much the same. Ones that I get asked about a lot are Moon Patrol, Motor Race USA, Aerobato, 1942, and those are not, because those were licensed from other companies. Moon Patrol
Make Tracks too.
What's that?
Make Tracks.
Make Tracks. I knew there was another one. I was losing my mind here. Yeah, so I had a Make Tracks. I finally sold it. If you've ever had one, you know
it.
it.
Had the 2 wires too on it.
Yeah, well, it was kind of a beast unto itself. That was at the time when Namco was suing anything that ate anything. So you couldn't. The original one, I guess, was sort of like Pac-Man. So they got sued, of course, and they couldn't bring it out. So that's why they switched it to a paint roller. Paint roller, rolling fish. The Japanese mind. What can I tell you? But yeah, it was. That was somebody in marketing decided they needed a maze game, so they bought the rights to Crush Roller, which was its real name, and stuck the Williams logo on it and shoved it out the door as Make Tracks. But yeah, that's a totally different architecture as well. And the question that I get is, how come on these multi-Williams cards I can't get these games? Well, that's why, because they're not. The multi-Williams games usually start with this, and then they've modified the ROM board to have all the ROMs on there, and then a soft switch to switch between the games because the hardware is close enough. So that's why on like the Clay one you get, he modified the code for Defender, so it uses all the same addresses as Stargate, so you get Defender and Stargate, Robotron Joust. I think that's what you get on the clay board, because I don't think he went as far as bubbles. There was a gentleman a couple of years ago out on the KLOV board. He goes by the name J-Rock, James, I can't think of his last name. He brought out one that quickly became known as the J-Rock board. This is generation 2. I have a generation 1, but it's in my multi-Williams and I'm not bringing it. But this replaces all of that for all of the games. And it adds a JAMA connector. So you can just plug it into a JAMA setup and you're ready to rock and roll. The main thing that he did was all of this hardware, plus all the other stuff, is all emulated in this big FPGA chip. There's the ROM, and then he chose to use a 6809, a real 6809, not an emulated one. The emulated ones, you know, emulation is real good for some things. CPUs, if you're building a spreadsheet, cool. The timing on a video game, not cool. So that's why MAME, some of the games, if you've ever played games on MAME, sometimes they are spot on, sometimes they are so far out, they're either really slow or they're really fast, or this part's really slow and that part's really fast, is because of the emulation of the CPU chips that go on it. And so I think he did a smart thing by putting the CPU, keeping it with the 6809. Same with the clay setup, because clay used the actual MPU boards. The reason these were called MPU boards and not just CPU boards, M stands for multi. I don't remember which of the hardware engineers, but he had a dream. His dream was to build a killer system. Where you'd have 4 cabinets all interlinked. And the Williams marketing department, in their infinite wisdom, called for the guys with the little white suits and sent them down to the rubber room, because nobody ever is going to want to do something like that. Play 4 games that are linked together. Oh my God. What have you been smoking down there? We got to come find some of it, because it's obviously better than our stuff. But they did eventually put a prototype out years after I was gone. It was called the Predator series, or the Raptor series, I think it was. Basically, it was named after 4 birds of prey. And they were 4 cabinets that were designed with 45-degree backs, so they'd all fit together as one module. You could buy each individual module and add them together. And one of them was the host that had this piece, and the other 4 were the slaves, if you will, or clients, I guess is a more technical, politically correct term these days. But they were all basically, this was the server and each of these were the clients. Unfortunately, it tested really well, and those marketing guys were like, I don't think anybody's going to ever buy these. So they never actually got beyond the prototype phase. There's a gentleman in England who managed to find one, and he is trying with some hardware engineers. He thinks he got this and that. So if he's got both of those, then he has a chance of reproducing this to create the client ones. But they've been having all kinds of problems. It's been, I think, 2 years now that they've been working on it. So far they haven't gotten the boards up and running, which is a shame, because I would just love to see that. I mean, this was back, I think, in 1985. If you think about it nowadays, Rush the Rock, Hydro Thunder, everything is linked together. Back then, nobody linked anything. So, I mean, this was like way out there. And, which is one of the reasons that I loved working at Williams. Because, I mean, in all the places that I've worked since then, there are very few people that I would point to and say, that guy's a genius. They were all over at Williams. I mean, you think about the amount of effort in order to be able to throw pixels onto the screen in 1982. I mean, that just wasn't done. Computers were used to put text on the screen so you could, I don't know what you did with text on a computer screen back then. Look at your bank account or something, or somebody could look at your bank account. I mean, they were used to talk to mainframes. They're not as ubiquitous as they are today, where you play games on them, your cell phone. I bet if we polled everybody here, everybody's cell phone has at least 5 games on it. Your home computer, everybody, that's why people buy home computers. That's the #1 reason. That's not the reason you tell their wives, but that's the reason they buy a home computer. But, it's just, the technology has marched on so much. And, I mean, you can see it out on the floor. You just see there's different generations all the way from a tack chopper or whatever that thing is, and there's a couple, they're not Rush the Rock, it's Cruisin' USA's, where they're using much more modern computers. I mean, it's just, the technology back then was crude, it looks crude, but you know what? It was fun. How many of you have a PS3 or an Xbox? We all have. I had a PS3. When I go, I plug a game in there. First thing that happens is square, circle. Hey, where'd my head go? I mean, you get 27 controls on that little pad, and trying to learn. I don't have the time to sit and spend, so some 8-year-old geek just blew me away in 10 seconds, because he's got all day to play on it. But you give me a joystick and a button, and I am a king. Not quite a god anymore. My reflexes have gone downhill quite a bit, but I am at least a king with a joystick and a button. And I think that's one of the reasons that I love bringing the games to this show, is because I loved working on them back in the day. I love playing them back in the day, and it's fun to see people's faces light up when they go, I remember putting 100 quarters into that game, or I remember, seeing that game back at the 7-Eleven, or, I mean, it's just, it's cool, and then I love seeing the kids that come in, that are the Xbox generation. And they see this and it's like, man, this is really cool. On the other hand, last night when I was, that's my Mag Max that's out in the hallway, because it got a little bit of battle damage on the way here, so didn't want to put it on the floor. I've got it fixed. But I'm sitting there fixing it and looking over, and right through that wall is all 200 games that are out on the floor. We got a kid sitting on the couch playing a game on his cell phone. I mean, it's like my head exploded. I didn't say anything to him. I didn't want to make him feel bad, but it just, you got $100,000 worth of fun in the next room, and you got your wristband. It's already paid for. What are you doing playing on your cell phone that you could do at home? One of the parties that I had, obviously I have a few games laying around the house too. So when we have parties, they're all turned on, and one of the parties, we see this little bunch of kids from probably 8 to 11, and they're all nudging each other. Finally walked up, what can I do for you guys? And one of them, they all like step back, just like the Three Stooges, step back. One is, thanks guys. So he's like, Mister, can you turn the Wii on for us? You have 30 years of arcade history just laying around. Your parents are playing the heck out of this stuff. Do you want to play the Wii? Sure. All I've got is Wii Sports. Oh, okay. They were just, I don't know if they're intimidated by it or it just, you know, their heads have been rewired by Microsoft and Sony and all those guys. If it doesn't have 27 buttons, they don't want to play it. But anyway, you know, I'm glad all of you guys are here. I'm glad for all of you guys that brought stuff. You know, because that gives me a chance to play some things that I can't afford or I, you know, haven't yet acquired for my collection. When I get the 8,000 square foot house, I will have a shot at some of those. We'll talk about a few other odds and ends. As somebody pointed out, there is a difference between these little battery holders and these little bright and shining objects. The difference is these take AAA batteries which leak. And, no problem. Now, everybody says, oh, it's the battery juice, the acid eating the boards up. Two things wrong with that statement. Number one, batteries haven't had acid in them since the mid-70s. They went to alkaline technology back then, and so it's actually alkali that's eating them up. And number two, if you all know how the Williams boards are mounted, the Defenders were mounted like this. These guys are mounted on the door, get it right here, like this. Since when do batteries defy gravity and drip up? If it's going to drip, it's going to drip that way. And that's why these were put in this corner, was they knew that they would leak and they would leak down. What causes all this lovely green stuff on here is called outgassing. The batteries internally build up gases. Those gases are corrosive. The gases are also lighter than air, so they flow up over the chips. That's what causes the corrosion. These little babies, the little button cells, are hermetically sealed. They don't outgas. They won't leak unless you throw it in a fire. That one would have. That one went through a fire. But basically, they're designed for electronics. I mean, they use very similar things to this in your PC for the real-time clock. And so they were designed not to cause grief. And these are really horribly expensive. They're probably about $100 for a pack of 100.
That's $1 each.
Yeah. So these, there's only a couple places out on the net that are selling them.
What's the number?
They sell them for $7.98 a piece, plus shipping.
I'm just one, so.
3 little batteries, the little AAA batteries are, they're, by the time you break them down, unless you're buying them in like the Sam-sized boxes, they end up being about 50 to 75 cents a piece. So you've got $1.50 at best in an $8 holder, and it'll last you, if you're lucky, it'll last a year, assuming they don't get too hot and outgas and burn your PC up. These guys, you can buy them online for as little as 30 cents a piece. You can go down to Hong Kong Fooey Tools, or Harbor Freight Tools, and you get a little card. I know I had one here. It's probably in this pocket. Cargo shorts. You stick anything in them. But you get, I think so this had 4 of them. for $2.98, and when they're having the special sales, these go for $1 a pack for 4. They'll last at least a year. I've had some that have lasted 3 years. So, cost-wise, cost is not an issue on these things. The amount of damage that those batteries will do to these boards, I mean, I have a whole box of boards that are damaged beyond repair, unless I literally strip all of the chips in this section completely off. Yes, at this point, the boards are fairly easy to get a hold of. I mean, there's several 100,000 of them out there. So it's not yet at a point where I'm desperate for a board that I'll actually go through the trouble of stripping that area down and completely rebuilding it. Someday maybe, not right now. So when people ask, well, why should I do the battery mod? Why not? It's more economical than your AA batteries. It's not going to cause damage to your board. You won't be calling me up in another couple of years saying, hey, my board doesn't work, can you fix it? You know, so if you don't do it, oh, yeah, I forgot, there is an additional cost. You have this little piece of wire down here too. Yeah, those are very rare and hard to find, which is why they sell for $8 on eBay. Used to be you could get the little button cell holders at Radio Shack, but like everything else electronic, they don't sell it unless it's 2 years old, so they don't sell those anymore. The other thing that I was going to talk about, the guys who've seen this talk before, not that it's ever the same twice. It's like a snowflake. Talks tend to be wandering all over the place and pile deep. Talk a little bit about how to and how not to pull the ribbon cables out. This is an ongoing battle. If any of you subscribe to KLOV, I'm on there as Yellow Dog. And one of the things that I'm a broken record about is somebody comes on and says, my joust just suddenly stopped working. What did you do? Well, I took the ribbon cable off. How did you take the ribbon cable off? Well, I grabbed it and I pulled. Well, if any of you know what an IDC connector is. Insulation displacement connector. Basically, they look like little Ys, where this is sharp, like a blade. You take your piece of wire and you jam it down onto there so that it looks like this. And it cuts the plastic, displacing it, leaving you with the wire touching the contacts. Well, when you grab the wires and you pull it, what's the first thing that's going to happen? These things are going to come out.
The wires are going to get cut.
The wires won't get cut, but what will happen is that you will end up with something that looks like this. This is insulator. There's your wires. There's the connector that you're supposed to be connecting to. Anybody see a problem there? You're not getting connectivity anymore. And I think I'll leave that one down. So, what I found, somebody, again, probably in the marketing department in Williams, decided that they were going to save 29 cents on each of these by not putting the little cams on them. And, you know, I mean, it's hard to go back and fault them for it because these boards were only supposed to last 2 years. They are not supposed to be here. They were to be put out in the field so that they could be thrown away when the quarters stopped coming in. So the fact that we have them at all 30 years later is just totally amazing. But the way to do it is to take, they used to give these out at shows and things. I wish they would again. It's just a little flat-bladed screwdriver. This one has a little Phillips head on the other end. You take the flat blade, you don't go in and pry it out, but you basically go and push on the side. You can do it with a sharp, something sharp like an ice pick as well, until you get it loosened and then grab it and pull it off. Now, afterwards, if you want to come up and take a look at it, if you hold this to the light, you can actually see the metal underneath the wires from my pulling it out like that. So think about doing that how many times over the last 30 years, and it's, you know, that if you're lucky, there was a ground line that you just pulled loose, and there's a couple of those in there, so you're still okay. More than likely it's an address line, and now you're either not going to run at all because the CPU, which is on the MPU board on here, can't talk across that ribbon cable to the ROMs to get its instructions. The other thing that will happen is that it'll be able to get enough of the instructions, but because the whole address line is across here, it'll mess up the RAM space, and you won't be able to read the RAM. You'll get the 131 error. One means that there's a RAM error. The other two numbers, when it flashes on the ROM card, is the row and the chip number. So 131 means RAM, bank 3, chip 1. 125 means RAM, bank 2, chip 5. So when you see those numbers, that's what they mean. It's just shorthand so you can go in and pull the one that's bad and replace it. Unless you've been playing with the ribbon cable, in which case you can swap RAM all day long and you're not going to fix it. The way to fix it is to re-crimp the connector. If you're brave and foolhardy, or you've done it a lot, you can use a pair of lock pliers to do it. I don't recommend that. The best way is to take a regular wood vise or a vise, put 2 pieces of fairly heavy fabric or fold it a couple of times, put it in and slowly crank it down so that it gets even pressure. If you do a lot of them like I do, you go out and buy the little hand one that does the same thing. It has 2 plates that come together when you squeeze it, so it squeezes it down evenly. If you don't squeeze it evenly, you run the risk of popping the little side connectors on it, or just plain not getting it done right. They do make replacements. Digitkey has them. Go out on KLOV, you can. It gets posted periodically, or people will ask for it, and I'll get you the part numbers. Obviously, it's something I don't carry around in my head. But that, you wouldn't believe how many times I get this, you know, my game doesn't work. Recrimp it. Oh, now it's working. Cool. Now you don't have to send me your boards. I mean, if I was truly in this as a businessman, it would be like, yeah, my rates are this, ship me your boards. But I don't have to pay the mortgage out of board repairs. Thank God I have a day job. Well, I don't know. Doing arcade stuff full time? Probably not enough money. Anyway. Yeah, it's definitely, it would definitely be seasonal. Because once you get everything fixed, then there's no more customers. So.
Hey, this stuff breaks like clockwork.
Yeah, well, some of it does. I'm actually, it depends on how well it's repaired, whether they go and find what was wrong with it, or they go and find what's really wrong with the board. That's one of the reasons I spend so much time, is I go beyond just which chip is bad. I try and find out why that chip is bad, because usually you get a chain. It's not just this chip, but this one and that one and that one. So you have to test all of them. The other thing I usually talk about, and I usually have the piece here, is when you're troubleshooting these boards, for God's sake, people, go out and get a multimeter so you can test the voltage. If the voltages aren't right, you're screwed. You know, pardon my French, but there's no nice way to say it. You are just hosed if your voltages aren't right. And you can't rely on the 3 little LEDs, because those are there just to sort of, as, yeah, sort of, we have electricity.
Yeah.